In other words, taking a look at what Aristotle has to say in the Poetics helps us enormously in recognizing what Thucydides understands himself as providing us with. And what I mean by that is the following. In the 9th section of Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle uses philosophy as the standard by which to distinguish between history and poetry. Now, the fact that he uses philosophy as the standard is itself worthy of its own discussion. But leaving that aside, I'll simply read what Aristotle has to say here, and you'll immediately recognize why I'm emphasizing Aristotle as helpful in better recognizing what we might mistakenly bring with ourselves to Thucydides that causes us to misunderstand Thucydides as merely history. This is what Aristotle says. It's not the task of the poet to speak of what has come to be, but rather to speak of what sort of things would come to be. In other words, of what is possible according to the likely or the necessary. A sidebar real quickly. What he's saying is that poetry does not provide history. Rather, poetry provides that which is possible based upon that which is likely or necessary. And then continuing, he says, for the historian and the poet do not differ by speaking either in meters or without meters, because if that were simply the case, it would be possible for the writings of Herodotus to be put in meters, and they would no less be a history with meter than without meter. Rather, they differ in this. The one speaks of what has come to be, while the other speaks of what sort would come to be. Therefore, poetry is more philosophic and of more stature than history, for poetry speaks rather of the general things, while history speaks of the particular things. Okay, so this is, according to Aristotle, the philosophical difference between poetry and history. Namely, history speaks of what has come to be, and that's to say that history deals with the particular. And in contrast to that, poetry speaks of what could come to be based upon either the likely or the necessary. And so what that means is that poetry speaks about the universal. So history speaks of the particular, poetry speaks of the universal. What we have here is a hierarchy of the fundamental concepts that describe fields of inquiry, namely philosophy, poetry, and history. And what distinguishes them is the extent to which they're dependent upon unique characteristics, which we refer to as particulars, or characteristics that are not unique and they simply endure. Well, unique and endure through what? Through time. So temporality, or time itself, is fundamental to these distinctions that are being made for these fundamental concepts that we casually use the words philosophy, poetry, or history to describe. Now, the reason that's worth keeping in mind is because what comes along with our baggage of this concept called history today are various philosophies of history. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that in this discussion subsequently, but I just want to make a note of that here. So just to clarify, the characteristic of uniqueness, of particularity, is thoroughly dependent upon time, temporality, whereas the characteristic of a universal is not dependent upon time or temporality. And always remember, the purpose of my entire series here on technology and nihilism is to lead us into the thought of Martin Heidegger. And for Heidegger, what we're going to see is that such fundamental distinctions based upon temporality can no longer be made at all. And that's going to be a sort of culmination of the various philosophies of history that begin to emerge roughly around the late 18th century, going all the way into the 20th century. So I just want you to keep that in mind here, because it's that view to the end of what the purpose of this whole series is that makes it necessary for us to belabor some of these otherwise very subtle details that might seem very strange or out of place here. But concerning those subtleties here, what we have is a hierarchy. Philosophy is the highest, precisely because it's the standard by which the other two are to be judged. And underneath philosophy, you have poetry, and then underneath poetry, you have history. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that this is the final word on any kind of hierarchy with regard to these concepts. I'm simply saying that this is helpful for us in better understanding Thucydides. And so again, according to Aristotle, the historian stays within the particular, while the poet deals with the universal. But as we're going to see, even in the opening paragraph of Thucydides, he's going to claim to have found within the particular of the Peloponnesian War a universal. But according to Aristotle's hierarchy here, the only thing that deals with both the particulars and the universals is philosophy. But Thucydides is not doing philosophy, at least according to Aristotle's partitioning here of these things. Our question is this: how does Thucydides transcend the particular of the Peloponnesian War in order to grasp, as he's going to claim, a universal without himself being philosophical? And another way to phrase that is that Thucydides claims to present with his text, the Peloponnesian War, a universal within the particular.